Hey, welcome to Billings, Montana, and welcome to the rims. You can see the south rims right over there across the valley, and the north rims that we're standing on right here. Hear all that sound coming up out of Billings, Montana there? Anyone who's ever been to Billings knows what I'm standing on here. Several hundred feet of sheer sandstone cliffs surrounding a pretty sizable portion of the city. On a clear day, it doesn't matter where you are in Billings, the rims are always there watching. I grew up in Billings, and whenever someone who's never been here before comes to visit, it's always the rims that captures their attention the most, and it makes sense. After all, pretty much everyone who's ever spent any real amount of time in Billings has at least a few stories about them. So before I get into the history of these babies, let me tell you a few stories about my own personal attachment to them. One time in high school, me and a couple friends climbed down there into that big hole, and my friend slipped and slid down a 10-foot rock like a big slide and broke his ankle. One time this girl got her car stuck in the snow up on the rims here, and I was trying to help her get it out. So I was sitting in the front seat of her car and trying to rock it back and forth and stuff, but she had a drunk friend in the back seat who woke up to me sitting in the front, revving the engine really loud with the car facing off the edge. So she thought I was trying to drive us off the cliff at 90 miles an hour, like... When I was a kid, we lived right under the rims, and there was this one tree up there that me and my siblings called the monster tree. Because for some reason, if you looked up at it, I mean really looked up at it, really let it stare back at you, you just might get a little bit freaked out. All right, that's enough about me. So what exactly are the rims and how do they get here? Well, you ever heard of the Western Interior Seaway? That big gigantic ocean that used to split North America into two separate continents? Well, over 100 million years ago, that seaway covered basically all of Montana, including Billings right here. Sea had a habit of raising and lowering over the years, which over time left big layered deposits of sand all around the bottom of the ocean. Then eventually, as the sea dried up for good, the sand was compacted down to create these sandstone rocks that we see here today. But that alone really only explains how the rocks themselves got here, right? Where did the great big sharp cliffs come from? Well, for that, we turn to the Yellowstone River. You see, over 1 million years ago, this river was much more massive than the already pretty sizable Yellowstone that we see here today. Flowed right over top of the former bed of the seaway, and over time, it just kind of gouged its way down through the sandstone bit by bit, carving out the Yellowstone River Valley. And now we've got the rims. As you can probably guess, there's all sorts of deep history connected to these big hunks of rock. Humans love valleys and natural border zones alike, and the rims have created both here. But you know, instead of going into some long narrative about the history of Billings, Montana and the rims, I decided I wanted to try something a little different. So I'm just gonna give you a little collection of anecdotes related to the rims, right? A cavalcade of rims history. So let's get going. Hey, here's a good one to start with. See this spot right here? Back in the 1880s, a sandstone quarry operated right here behind what is now a university and one of the few roads that leads up to the top of the rims. It was initially open to give trains bringing supplies into Billings something to ship back out when they left. Teams of 50 men used to cut and haul stone out of the rims here up until 1927 when the quarry finally closed. And you know, even though it's been gone for almost 100 years now, plenty of sandstone from this quarry can still be found floating around Billings to this day. Look, here's some as a traffic barricade on a pullout up on the rims, and here's some more encircling a tennis court at a Billings park. And here's the only building left in the whole town where you can still see that old quarry sandstone hard at work, keeping a roof up. The Western Heritage Center. Every other building that used the quarry stone has either been taken down or had something else put over top of its walls. Hey, here's something kind of cool. Obviously, you want to set up a town's radio station somewhere high, you know, somewhere where the signal can reach a long ways without anything interrupting it. Well, the rims seem pretty much tailor-made for that, right? Here we are up on top, and here's a bunch of the town's radio stations. Bing, 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 bing. Check this out. See this paved road here? It was originally mapped out and constructed back in 1936 as a pretty little drive meant to show off the beauty of the rims in the river valley. At first, it was just called the Rimrocks Scenic Drive, but then in the 40s, it was renamed as the Chief Black Otter Trail to add a little more mystique and Western appeal for tourists coming through. According to the people that named the trail, Chief Black Otter was a famous Crow Native American chief who was killed in a great battle with the Sioux. Since he was then buried here against the rims, the name was meant to honor his courage, sacrifice, and legend. Only one problem though. Apparently the guy never actually existed. They just kind of made up the name to make the trail sound cool. Of course, just because people in the past made up Native American connection to the rims doesn't mean there wasn't any to begin with. Over here, we have one of the most beautiful sections of cliffs. The rims are at their tallest in this area, and you get a great view of both the city and the undeveloped rolling hills just to the south of town. Mighty Yellowstone rolls along just under your feet over here too. This land used to be one of a few fasting sites for the great Crow Chief 4 dances. According to some legends that I read, he received one of his most powerful and illuminating visions while fasting along this ridge. Nowadays, the gorgeous little spot bears his name, the 4 Dances Recreation Area. Hey, remember I said that people not from Billings tend to be pretty interested in the rims? Well, here's something else that in my experience also catches their eyes. The ditch. They're all drained right now for the winter season, but in warmer months there's a whole system of big and little ditches snaking their way through Billings, providing irrigation water to the city. Coolest part about the ditch though is right here, where it flows through the rims. See, Billings is split into 2 main sections, the valley down here and the heights up here, which are basically sitting up on top of the rims. So back in 1903, they had a problem, right? How do we connect the irrigation waterways for the 2 halves of the city? Well, the answer's right here, an 1,800-foot tunnel dug directly through the rims. Apparently, they had 2 separate crews working on both the north and south side of the rims at the same time. They dug their way through the sandstone simultaneously and then met up in the middle of the rock. Apparently, their digging was so precise that the 2 tunnels were only off by a couple inches when they finally joined together. Now, as you might guess, the rims can be a little dangerous too. Every once in a while, you hear about a news story about how a big rock fell off the rims and rolled down and crushed somebody's house. Like right here, for example. There used to be a house right there in that empty plot before a gigantic boulder broke off the rims right here and came down and smashed it into oblivion. Don't worry, no one was hurt in this particular incident though. See that cliff right there? That's the most prominent point on the rims. You can see it from pretty much anywhere in town. Nowadays, we call it Sacrifice Cliff. It's part of the 4 Dances area I was talking about earlier, and it's definitely the most famous rock outcropping along the length of the rims here. Now, there's actually a lot of contention on why we call this Sacrifice Cliff. Depending on who you ask, you'll hear all sorts of stories, from running buffalo off the edge of the cliff to some kind of ritual sacrifice killing happening on its ridges. Most common story though, and the one that, at least according to what I've read, has the most support from Crow oral history, is that a few surviving members of a Crow village stricken with smallpox hurled themselves off the cliff rather than continue life without the rest of their people. Now, the specific details surrounding that story seem to warp and change depending on what you read and hear, so I can't pretend to know reality from myth or fiction. But what makes this story even more interesting is that some people aren't even sure if that's the real Sacrifice Cliff. A lot of the stories place Sacrifice Cliff more over here, far away from the gigantic sandstone ledge that bears the name now. In fact, I even read that a lot of tourism material for Billings from the earliest 20th century mirrors that placement, citing these ridges over here as the location of Sacrifice Cliff. It's really only been in the last few decades that the cliff changed its location. So because of that, a lot of people think the location was switched over deliberately to try to encourage tourism, since this cliff is a lot more prominent and easier to see from a distance. Hey, check it out. Here's some stairs going up the rims. The Chamber of Commerce actually cut these out over 110 years ago, back in 1910. Reason was pretty simple, just an easy way to get to the top of the rims. Oh, sorry, I can't get any closer than that. Really slick. And the path up is literally pure ice right here. There's actually another set of stairs going up the rims, like right over here. And if you climb those at the top, you'll find here's another cool little spot with some potential Native American history. When a U.S. Army lieutenant came through here in 1876, a few of his guides from the Crow tribe told him a bit about that little cliff right there on the eastern end of the northern portion of the rims. Apparently this little place here used to be called the Place of the Skulls. Victims of smallpox or other disease were buried up on the hill there. We also have an account from a Dr. Allen that used to live in nearby Coulson, Montana that seems to corroborate the story. He wrote in his journal that he one day stumbled upon a bunch of skeletons up on the rims that were mounted up on trees. The bodies were tied to the trees with a bunch of items of Crow tribe origin spread around the body. One thing to take account with this story, though, is that it might have a tinge of the Black Otter Trail or Sacrifice Cliff effect going on with it. Because apparently some people think that Dr. Allen actually found those skeletons over there on the other side of the valley. And some people even think that Sacrifice Cliff and the Place of the Skulls are just two different names for the same place. But whatever the real story is, there at least seems to be some kind of kernel of truth to the idea that Crow victims of smallpox were at one point enshrined, at least someplace along the rims. Hey, you ever heard of the artist Will James? Well, Will James used to stay in this cabin on top of the rims right here, and in fact, according to some sources, he basically used it as a sort of lockup to cool off in whenever he got too drunk. Just hang up here for a few hours, sobering up, looking down into the valley. Pretty cool, huh? And right here we got Boot Hill Cemetery, a little burial ground used early on in white people settlement of the river valley. See how it's tucked right up against the rims here? There's not really any original burial markers left, and records on the people buried here are a little shaky. But just to give you an idea of what life was like here back in the 1870s and 80s, I thought I'd read off a few of the causes of death that we do have for the people buried here. Billy Needham, gunshot. Lewis Johnson, gunshot. Michael Cook, suicide. Unnamed soldier, drowned in the river. 30 Crow Native Americans buried in a mass grave. Smallpox. Ed Prebles poisoned himself to death on top of the rims because he got caught in a blizzard and didn't want to freeze to death. Josephine somehow drowned in a water barrel. Clarence J. Topliff fell off a horse during a race and died. Judge Fox hit by a train. H.M. Muggins Taylor shot while trying to stop another man from beating up his wife. William Stoltz, alcohol poisoning. John E. Hart, gunshot. Okay, you get the idea, right? Oh, also, there's a pretty large amount of people buried in this cemetery who died of accidental gunshot. Like someone was cleaning their gun or something and accidentally went off and shot them. At least that's what the records say, right? Oh yeah, and my favorite story about somebody buried here, there's this guy named Dutch Henry who was kind of like a notorious outlaw, and he was over in Coulson, Montana, a little ways from here, playing cards in a saloon. And he wasn't doing very well, and I guess the other players were kind of needling him, teasing him, you know? So Dutch Henry said, all right, the next person that says anything to me is getting shot dead, or something along those lines, right? And so everyone played cards in silence for a second, and then the waiter came in and asked the guy if he wanted a drink or something, and boom! Dutch just blasted him. And hey, you might have heard me mention Coulson, Montana a couple times in this video and wondered where it was. Well, here it is. That's right. There's literally nothing left of Coulson nowadays. Not a speck. This little town was first set up in 1877, predating Billings, Montana by a few years. Most of those people buried over in Boot Hill Cemetery that I was just telling you about were from over here in Coulson. Town had quite the reputation, as you can probably guess. No church, no school, just saloons, dust, and the rims. Now, the story of Coulson, Montana could really be its own video, and maybe I will do one on it one day, so I'll save you the finer details, but here's a quick version. The town was set up before the railroad came through the valley and was pretty much totally going to be dependent on the railroad going through Coulson when it did eventually come through the area, right? It was kind of like they were just trying to get the jump on becoming a little boom town, sort of like a gamble. But when the railroad companies actually did come through, they decided to just start up a totally new town instead. And thus, Billings was born. Coulson dried up fast. Like, literally entire buildings were just picked up and walked down the road to Billings. Whole town only lasted 5 years. It was gone completely by 1882. But what does that have to do with the rims, right? Well, I don't know. I guess I just kind of like thinking about how they just like sat up there and watched the whole thing unfold, right? Like, do you think as the town of Coulson was making that gamble on the railroad coming through, that the rims were up there whispering among themselves, trying to decide if the gamble's gonna pay off or not? Hey, maybe they were taking bets themselves, you know. They're great cracks kind of rumbling and scratching together as they murmur to each other. And what about Will James, right? His cabin's like right up there. How many times do you think the rims watched him stumble up the mountain up to his drunk tank cabin? And hey, the hole through the rims where the ditch goes, I mean, it's so precise, right? The tunnels join together perfectly. Well, maybe the rims, as the miners were in there cracking away at the stone, every once in a while, they just got real close and whispered in their ear, hey, a little closer to the left, a little more to the right. Just kind of guiding the pickaxe, keeping everything on track. And the quarry, that must have been crazy for him, right? Imagine sitting up there watching little bits of yourself get spread all over the river valley, and probably spread all over the country and maybe even the world. You know, all that rocks heading out on the trains. I don't know, it's just kind of crazy thinking about how those great stone sentinels up there have watched a huge portion of my life, and probably a lot of people's entire lives, right? You know, as far back as 20, 200, even 2,000 years ago. Just these big old colossi watching us all. Well, I can watch you back, you know. You're not the only one who's good at staring. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.